The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training ground as Sergeant Mike Chen adjusted his combat gear. At 24, he was the youngest sergeant in his unit, having earned his stripes through exceptional performance and unwavering dedication. His fellow soldiers respected him, but some questioned whether his rapid promotion had come too quickly. The base was buzzing with unusual energy today. Word had spread that Master Sergeant James "Iron Mike" Rodriguez would be visiting their unit for a special combat demonstration. Rodriguez was a legend among the ranks, a 30-year veteran who had served in 3 different conflicts and earned more medals than most soldiers could count in a lifetime. His reputation for hand-to-hand combat was unmatched, and stories of his prowess had become the stuff of military folklore. Chen had heard the stories since his first day of basic training. Rodriguez could supposedly take down 3 men at once, had never lost a sparring match, and could break boards with his bare hands like they were paper. The older soldiers spoke of him with a mixture of awe and fear, sharing tales of recruits who had challenged him only to find themselves flat on their backs before they knew what hit them. As the unit assembled on the training ground, Chen felt a familiar flutter of nervous excitement in his stomach. He had always been competitive, a trait that had served him well throughout his military career. Back in high school, he had been the captain of the wrestling team, and he had continued training in martial arts even after joining the army. His fellow soldiers often joked that he was always looking for a challenge, always trying to prove himself against bigger and more experienced opponents. The sound of approaching vehicles drew everyone's attention. A black military SUV pulled up to the edge of the training area, and outstepped Master Sergeant Rodriguez. Even from a distance, his presence was commanding. He was not particularly tall, standing around 5 feet 9 inches, but his build was solid and compact. His gray hair was cut in a perfect military style, and his uniform was pressed to perfection. Every movement he made seemed deliberate and controlled, like a predator conserving energy. Colonel Patterson, the unit commander, stepped forward to greet the visiting legend. The 2 men shook hands with the kind of firm grip that spoke of mutual respect earned through years of service. Patterson had arranged this demonstration as part of ongoing training exercises, believing that his soldiers could learn valuable lessons from watching a master at work. Rodriguez's eyes swept across the assembled soldiers, taking in their faces with the practiced gaze of someone who had sized up countless opponents. When his attention briefly landed on Chen, the young sergeant felt as though he was being evaluated, measured, and catalogued in that single moment. There was something in the veteran's expression that seemed to say he had seen Chen's type before: young, eager, and perhaps a little too confident for their own good. The demonstration was scheduled to begin with basic techniques, progressing to more advanced combat scenarios. Rodriguez would be working with volunteers from the unit, showing proper form and explaining the principles behind each move. It was meant to be educational, a chance for the soldiers to learn from someone who had perfected these skills through decades of real-world experience. Chen found himself studying Rodriguez's every movement as the veteran began his warm-up routine. The man moved with a fluid grace that seemed to defy his age, and the wear that 3 decades of military service should have left on his body. His stretches were precise, his shadow boxing crisp and economical. Each punch and kick was thrown with perfect form, and Chen could see why the man had earned such a fearsome reputation. As the formal demonstration began, Rodriguez called for volunteers to help illustrate various techniques. Several soldiers stepped forward, and Chen watched as the master sergeant worked with each one. He was patient and instructive, breaking down complex movements into understandable components. But even in these controlled demonstrations, his skill was evident. When he moved, it was like watching a chess master who could see 10 moves ahead while his opponents were still figuring out the rules. The morning progressed with Rodriguez demonstrating throws, joint locks, and defensive techniques. Each volunteer who worked with him came away with a new appreciation for the complexity and precision required in hand-to-hand combat. They also came away with a healthy respect for just how dangerous Rodriguez could be if he chose to be. Chen felt his competitive instincts stirring as he watched. He had been training hard for months, working on new techniques he had learned from online tutorials and martial arts videos. In his mind, he had been preparing for exactly this kind of opportunity, a chance to test his skills against a real opponent. to see how far his training had taken him. The young sergeant began to imagine himself stepping forward, volunteering for the next demonstration. In his mind's eye, he could see himself holding his own against the legendary Rodriguez, maybe even surprising the veteran with some of the newer techniques he had been practicing. The thought was intoxicating, and Chen found himself shifting his weight from foot to foot, his muscles tensing with anticipation. What Chen didn't fully understand was that confidence and skill were not always the same thing. His enthusiasm and natural athletic ability had carried him far in his military career. But there was a difference between training in controlled environments and facing an opponent with 3 decades of real combat experience. Rodriguez had not earned his reputation through demonstrations and training exercises. He had earned it in situations where the stakes were life and death. As the morning demonstration continued, Chen's desire to prove himself grew stronger. He was young, fit, and convinced that his recent training had given him an edge that might surprise even a veteran like Rodriguez. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would teach everyone present a valuable lesson about the difference between confidence and wisdom, between potential and proven skill. The demonstration had been running for almost an hour when Rodriguez called for a break. The soldiers gathered around water stations discussing what they had witnessed with a mixture of amazement and respect. Chen noticed how the other volunteers who had worked with Rodriguez were flexing their arms and rolling their shoulders. Clear evidence that even the controlled demonstrations had given them a workout. During the break, Chen found himself in conversation with Corporal Davis, one of the soldiers who had volunteered earlier. Davis was rubbing his wrist and grimacing slightly as he described his experience. "I thought I knew what I was doing," Davis said, shaking his head. "But when Rodriguez grabbed my arm, it was like being caught in a steel trap. The man hasn't lost a step, even at his age." Chen listened to Davis's account, but internally he was analyzing what he had observed. He had noticed that most of the volunteers had been somewhat passive during their demonstrations, allowing Rodriguez to guide them through the techniques without offering much resistance. In Chen's mind, this made the demonstrations less realistic and potentially less impressive than they appeared. Maybe the volunteers were just being too polite, Chen suggested to Davis. In a real situation, Rodriguez would be facing someone who was actually trying to fight back. Davis looked at Chen with surprise. "You think any of us could give Rodriguez trouble? The man's a walking legend." Chen shrugged, trying to appear casual while his mind raced with possibilities. "I'm just saying that demonstrations are different from real fights. When someone's not really trying to resist, it's easier to make techniques look effortless." As the break ended and the soldiers reassembled, Colonel Patterson announced that the final portion of the demonstration would focus on defensive scenarios. Rodriguez would show how to handle situations where an opponent tried to overwhelm you with aggression or superior size. The master sergeant nodded and began explaining the principles of using an attacker's momentum against them. "In real combat," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying easily across the training ground, "your opponent won't always be cooperative. They'll come at you with everything they have, trying to overpower you through sheer force. The key is to remain calm, use proper technique, and turn their aggression into your advantage." He demonstrated several techniques using willing volunteers, showing how to redirect an incoming attack and use the attacker's own energy to put them on the ground. Each demonstration was smooth and controlled, with Rodriguez explaining his movement step by step. But Chen found himself focusing on what he saw as missed opportunities and openings that the volunteers weren't exploiting. When Rodriguez called for volunteers for the next demonstration, Chen's hand shot up immediately. Several other soldiers also volunteered, but Chen stepped forward with the kind of confident stride that made it clear he expected to be chosen. Rodriguez's eyes met his, and for a moment the veteran seemed to be weighing something in his mind. "Sergeant Chen, isn't it?" Rodriguez asked, and Chen felt a surge of pride that the legendary soldier knew his name. "Yes, Master Sergeant," Chen replied, standing at attention. "What's your experience with hand-to-hand combat?" Rodriguez inquired, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp and evaluating. Chen straightened his shoulders. "I was captain of my high school wrestling team, Master Sergeant. I've also been training in mixed martial arts and studying combat techniques online. I believe I can provide a more realistic demonstration of an aggressive opponent." A murmur went through the assembled soldiers. Some exchanged glances that suggested they thought Chen was being either very brave or very foolish. Rodriguez's expression remained unreadable, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle change that suggested he was now looking at Chen not as a student, but as a potential opponent. "I see," Rodriguez said slowly. "And you think the previous demonstrations weren't realistic enough?" Chen felt the weight of everyone's attention on him, but his confidence only grew. "I think they were good for showing technique, Master Sergeant, but in a real fight, an opponent would be trying to counter your moves and fighting back with everything they had." Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "That's a fair point, Sergeant. Combat is unpredictable, and it's important to prepare for opponents who won't simply go along with your techniques." He paused, seeming to consider his options. "Would you like to help me demonstrate what happens when someone does fight back with everything they have?" "Absolutely, Master Sergeant," Chen replied without hesitation. The other soldiers formed a wider circle around the two men, sensing that this demonstration might be different from the others. Colonel Patterson looked slightly concerned but didn't intervene, trusting Rodriguez's judgment and experience. The veteran began explaining the scenario to the watching soldiers. "Sergeant Chen is going to try to take me down using whatever techniques he thinks will work," Rodriguez announced. "This will show you how to defend against an opponent who is actively trying to defeat you, rather than simply going through the motions of a drill." Chen began to stretch and prepare himself mentally for what he saw as his big opportunity. He had been visualizing this moment for the past hour, planning his approach and thinking about which techniques might catch the experienced veteran off guard. His wrestling background gave him confidence in his takedown abilities, and his recent training in striking had made him feel more well-rounded as a fighter. Rodriguez removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms that were corded with muscle despite his age. His movements were still calm and controlled, but there was now an edge to his demeanor that hadn't been present during the earlier demonstrations. The other soldiers sensed it too, and the atmosphere on the training ground became more tense and focused. "The key thing to remember," Rodriguez said to the watching soldiers as he and Chen moved to the center of the circle, "is that real combat rarely goes according to plan. You have to be ready to adapt, to think on your feet, and to use whatever techniques the situation calls for." Chen bounced slightly on his toes, shaking out his arms and rolling his neck. He felt loose and ready, his muscles warm from watching the earlier demonstrations. In his mind, he was already seeing himself successfully taking down the veteran, imagining the respect and admiration he would earn from his fellow soldiers. What Chen couldn't see was the slight change in Rodriguez's stance, the way the veteran's weight shifted almost imperceptibly onto the balls of his feet. Years of experience had taught Rodriguez to read opponents quickly, and he had already identified several things about Chen's body language and preparation that told him exactly what kind of attack to expect. The two men faced each other in the center of the circle, and the training ground fell silent except for the sound of wind rustling through nearby trees. Chen felt his heart rate increase as he studied Rodriguez's stance, looking for weaknesses or openings he could exploit. The veteran stood in a relaxed but balanced position, his hands at his sides, his expression calm and almost casual. "Whenever you're ready, Sergeant," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying no trace of concern or urgency. Chen had spent the past few minutes planning his opening move. He decided to start with a feint to test Rodriguez's reactions, then follow up with a wrestling-style takedown that had served him well in high school competitions. His plan was to use his youth and speed to overwhelm the older man, before Rodriguez could bring his experience to bear. Chen stepped forward and threw a quick jab toward Rodriguez's face, not intending to make contact but hoping to create an opening for his real attack. Rodriguez's response was so subtle that Chen almost missed it, a slight tilt of the head that moved him just far enough to avoid the feint without any wasted motion. There was no dramatic dodge or block, just an economical movement that suggested Rodriguez had seen this exact technique many times before. Encouraged by what he interpreted as a successful feint, Chen immediately followed up with his planned takedown attempt. He shot in low, driving forward with his shoulders as he reached for Rodriguez's legs, intending to sweep them out from under the veteran. This was the move that had won him numerous wrestling matches, and he executed it with the speed and precision that had made him a champion. For a brief moment, Chen thought his plan was working. He felt his hands make contact with Rodriguez's legs, and he began to drive forward with all his strength. But then something went wrong. Instead of Rodriguez's legs buckling or giving way, Chen found himself meeting an immovable resistance, as if he had tried to tackle a tree instead of a man. Rodriguez had simply widened his stance and lowered his center of gravity, transforming himself from a mobile target into an unshakable foundation. His decades of experience had taught him exactly how to position his body to absorb and redirect the force of Chen's attack. Where Chen had expected to find legs he could sweep, he instead found a stance as solid as bedrock. But Rodriguez wasn't content to simply defend. As Chen struggled to complete his failed takedown, the veteran's hands moved with practiced precision. His right hand dropped down to grip Chen's collar while his left hand secured a hold on Chen's belt. These grips gave Rodriguez complete control over Chen's balance and movement, turning the young sergeant's own momentum against him. Chen realized something was wrong when he felt Rodriguez's hands secure their grips, but by then it was too late to change course. His wrestling training had taught him to commit fully to his attacks, and he had already put all his weight and energy into the takedown attempt. Now he found himself in a position where he couldn't retreat or change tactics without completely exposing himself. Rodriguez's next move was a masterpiece of timing and technique. Using the grips he had established, he lifted Chen slightly off the ground while simultaneously stepping to the side. The movement looked effortless, almost casual, but it completely destroyed Chen's balance and left him suspended in an impossible position. For a moment that seemed to last forever, Chen hung in the air, his feet off the ground and his weight entirely supported by Rodriguez's grip on his uniform. The watching soldiers gasped as they witnessed what happened next. Rodriguez didn't slam Chen to the ground with unnecessary force or try to humiliate him with a dramatic throw. Instead, he simply released his grips and allowed gravity to do the work. Chen fell backward, his arms windmilling as he tried desperately to regain his balance. But there was nothing he could do to prevent the inevitable. The sound of Chen hitting the ground echoed across the training area. Not the sharp crack of a violent impact, but the dull thud of someone who had been completely outmaneuvered. Chen landed flat on his back, the wind knocked out of him, staring up at the sky as he tried to process what had just happened. The entire exchange had taken less than 3 seconds from start to finish. Rodriguez stood over the fallen sergeant, not in a threatening way, but with the calm demeanor of someone who had just demonstrated a simple principle of physics. He extended his hand to help Chen up, his expression showing no triumph or satisfaction, just the patient professionalism of an instructor who had just provided an object lesson. "The key," Rodriguez said to the assembled soldiers as Chen struggled to catch his breath, "is understanding that technique will always defeat raw aggression. Sergeant Chen's attack was well executed and showed good fundamentals, but experience teaches you how to read an opponent's intentions and respond accordingly." Chen accepted Rodriguez's help getting to his feet, his face flushed with embarrassment, but also with a grudging respect for what he had just experienced. He had always prided himself on his physical abilities and his fighting skills, but in those 3 seconds, he had learned the difference between training and mastery, between confidence and competence. The other soldiers watched in stunned silence as Chen dusted himself off and tried to regain his composure. Many of them had been secretly hoping that their young sergeant might be able to give the legendary Rodriguez at least some trouble, but what they had witnessed instead was a demonstration of just how wide the gap could be between even skilled soldiers and true masters of their craft. Rodriguez continued his explanation as if nothing unusual had happened. "In combat, you'll often face opponents who are stronger, faster, or more aggressive than you are. The key is not to match their aggression with your own, but to use your training and experience to turn their strengths into weaknesses." Chen stood at the edge of the circle now, still somewhat dazed by how quickly and completely he had been defeated. His carefully planned attack had been neutralized so easily that it seemed like Rodriguez had known exactly what was coming before Chen had even moved. The veteran's timing had been perfect, his technique flawless, and his execution so smooth that it had looked almost effortless. The two men faced each other in the center of the circle, and the training ground fell silent except for the sound of wind rustling through nearby trees. Chen felt his heart rate increase as he studied Rodriguez's stance, looking for weaknesses or openings he could exploit. The veteran stood in a relaxed but balanced position, his hands at his sides, his expression calm and almost casual. "Whenever you're ready, Sergeant," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying no trace of concern or urgency. Chen had spent the past few minutes planning his opening move. He decided to start with a feint to test Rodriguez's reactions, then follow up with a wrestling-style takedown that had served him well in high school competitions. His plan was to use his youth and speed to overwhelm the older man before Rodriguez could bring his experience to bear. Chen stepped forward and threw a quick jab toward Rodriguez's face, not intending to make contact but hoping to create an opening for his real attack. Rodriguez's response was so subtle that Chen almost missed it, a slight tilt of the head that moved him just far enough to avoid the feint without any wasted motion. There was no dramatic dodge or block, just an economical movement that suggested Rodriguez had seen this exact technique many times before. Encouraged by what he interpreted as a successful feint, Chen immediately followed up with his planned takedown attempt. He shot in low, driving forward with his shoulders as he reached for Rodriguez's legs, intending to sweep them out from under the veteran. This was the move that had won him numerous wrestling matches, and he executed it with the speed and precision that had made him a champion. For a brief moment, Chen thought his plan was working. He felt his hands make contact with Rodriguez's legs, and he began to drive forward with all his strength. But then something went wrong. Instead of Rodriguez's legs buckling or giving way, Chen found himself meeting an immovable resistance, as if he had tried to tackle a tree instead of a man. Rodriguez had simply widened his stance and lowered his center of gravity, transforming himself from a mobile target into an unshakable foundation. His decades of experience had taught him exactly how to position his body to absorb and redirect the force of Chen's attack. Where Chen had expected to find legs he could sweep, he instead found a stance as solid as bedrock. But Rodriguez wasn't content to simply defend. As Chen struggled to complete his failed takedown, the veteran's hands moved with practiced precision. His right hand dropped down to grip Chen's collar while his left hand secured a hold on Chen's belt. These grips gave Rodriguez complete control over Chen's balance and movement, turning the young sergeant's own momentum against him. Chen realized something was wrong when he felt Rodriguez's hands secure their grips, but by then it was too late to change course. His wrestling training had taught him to commit fully to his attacks, and he had already put all his weight and energy into the takedown attempt. Now he found himself in a position where he couldn't retreat or change tactics without completely exposing himself. Rodriguez's next move was a masterpiece of timing and technique. Using the grips he had established, he lifted Chen slightly off the ground while simultaneously stepping to the side. The movement looked effortless, almost casual, but it completely destroyed Chen's balance and left him suspended in an impossible position. For a moment that seemed to last forever, Chen hung in the air, his feet off the ground and his weight entirely supported by Rodriguez's grip on his uniform. The watching soldiers gasped as they witnessed what happened next. Rodriguez didn't slam Chen to the ground with unnecessary force or try to humiliate him with a dramatic throw. Instead, he simply released his grips and allowed gravity to do the work. Chen fell backward, his arms windmilling as he tried desperately to regain his balance. But there was nothing he could do to prevent the inevitable. The sound of Chen hitting the ground echoed across the training area, not the sharp crack of a violent impact, but the dull thud of someone who had been completely outmaneuvered. Chen landed flat on his back, the wind knocked out of him, staring up at the sky as he tried to process what had just happened. The entire exchange had taken less than 3 seconds from start to finish. Rodriguez stood over the fallen sergeant, not in a threatening way, but with the calm demeanor of someone who had just demonstrated a simple principle of physics. He extended his hand to help Chen up, his expression showing no triumph or satisfaction, just the patient professionalism of an instructor who had just provided an object lesson. "The key," Rodriguez said to the assembled soldiers as Chen struggled to catch his breath, "is understanding that technique will always defeat raw aggression. Sergeant Chen's attack was well executed and showed good fundamentals, but experience teaches you how to read an opponent's intentions and respond accordingly." Chen accepted Rodriguez's help getting to his feet, his face flushed with embarrassment, but also with a grudging respect for what he had just experienced. He had always prided himself on his physical abilities and his fighting skills, but in those 3 seconds, he had learned the difference between training and mastery, between confidence and competence. The other soldiers watched in stunned silence as Chen dusted himself off and tried to regain his composure. Many of them had been secretly hoping that their young sergeant might be able to give the legendary Rodriguez at least some trouble, but what they had witnessed instead was a demonstration of just how wide the gap could be between even skilled soldiers and true masters of their craft. Rodriguez continued his explanation as if nothing unusual had happened. In combat, you'll often face opponents who are stronger, faster, or more aggressive than you are. The key is not to match their aggression with your own, but to use your training and experience to turn their strengths into weaknesses. Chen stood at the edge of the circle now, still somewhat dazed by how quickly and completely he had been defeated. His carefully planned attack had been neutralized so easily that it seemed like Rodriguez had known exactly what was coming before Chen had even moved. The veteran's timing had been perfect, his technique flawless, and his execution so smooth that it had looked almost effortless. In the days following the demonstration, Chen found himself becoming something of a celebrity on the base, though not necessarily in the way he had hoped. The story of his 2-second defeat at the hands of Master Sergeant Rodriguez had spread throughout the unit and beyond, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Some versions had him flying through the air, others described him being knocked unconscious, and a few particularly creative accounts suggested he had challenged Rodriguez to a formal duel. Despite the embarrassment of having his defeat become base gossip, Chen discovered that the experience was changing his approach to training and his understanding of combat in ways he hadn't expected. The brief encounter with Rodriguez had shattered several assumptions he had held about fighting and had forced him to reconsider what it meant to be truly skilled in hand-to-hand combat. Chen began seeking out additional training opportunities with renewed humility and focus. He requested permission to attend advanced combat courses and began studying historical military fighting techniques with the intensity of a scholar. His fellow soldiers noticed the change in his demeanor. Where he had once been quick to offer advice or demonstrate techniques, he now listened more and spoke less. Corporal Martinez, one of Chen's close friends in the unit, approached him after a particularly intense training session. "You've been different since that demonstration with Rodriguez," Martinez observed. "More serious, more focused. Are you okay?" Chen paused his stretching routine and considered the question. "I think I'm better than okay," he said finally. "That experience taught me that I had been training with the wrong mindset. I was so focused on proving how good I was that I wasn't actually learning anything new." Martinez nodded thoughtfully. "Rodriguez really got to you, didn't he?" "In the best possible way," Chen replied. "I realized that I had been confusing confidence with competence. I thought because I could handle myself against other soldiers my age and experience level, I was ready to take on anyone. Rodriguez showed me there are levels of skill I hadn't even imagined." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sergeant First Class Thompson, who had been looking for Chen. Thompson was known throughout the unit as one of the most experienced non-commissioned officers, having served multiple deployments and earned respect for his combat expertise. "Chen, I heard about what happened with Rodriguez," Thompson said, his tone neutral but his eyes showing interest. "Word is you've been training harder than ever since then." Chen straightened slightly, unsure whether he was about to receive criticism or encouragement. "Yes, Sergeant. I'm trying to learn from the experience." Thompson smiled approvingly. "Good. Most soldiers who get humbled like that either become bitter and defensive or they give up and decide they'll never be good enough. The smart ones use it as a wake-up call to get serious about their training." Over the following weeks, Chen threw himself into improving his combat skills with an intensity that surprised even his closest friends. He studied videos of professional fighters, analyzed different martial arts styles, and began incorporating elements from various disciplines into his training routine. But more importantly, he changed his approach to sparring and practice sessions. Where he had once entered training with the goal of dominating his opponents, Chen now focused on learning something from each encounter. He began asking more experienced soldiers for advice, requesting feedback on his techniques and admitting when he didn't understand something. This shift in attitude led to rapid improvements in his abilities and earned him new respect from his peers. The breakthrough moment came during a unit-wide combat training exercise 3 weeks. After the Rodriguez demonstration, Chen was paired against Staff Sergeant Williams, a soldier known for his aggressive fighting style and impressive record in unit competitions. In the past, Chen might have tried to match Williams's aggression with his own, attempting to overpower his opponent through sheer determination. Instead, Chen approached the match with the lessons he had learned from Rodriguez. He studied Williams's movements during the warm-up period, noting the sergeant's preferred attacks and defensive patterns. Rather than rushing in with his own offense, Chen focused on positioning himself correctly and waiting for opportunities to counterattack. The match lasted longer than most observers expected. Williams came forward with his typical aggressive style, throwing powerful punches and attempting to overwhelm Chen with rapid combinations. But Chen had learned to use his opponent's momentum against him, just as Rodriguez had demonstrated. He moved with economy and precision, avoiding Williams' attacks while looking for openings to exploit. When the opportunity came, Chen executed a perfect counter-throw that sent Williams to the mat in a controlled but decisive manner. The technique was clean and efficient, showing none of the wild aggression that had characterized Chen's previous fighting style. Instead, it demonstrated the kind of tactical thinking and technical precision that marked truly skilled fighters. The watching soldiers erupted in surprised cheers, not because Chen had won, but because of how he had won. His victory over Williams was impressive, but the way he had achieved it showed a level of growth and maturity that hadn't been evident in his fighting before the Rodriguez encounter. Williams got to his feet and shook Chen's hand with genuine respect. "That was beautiful, Chen. You've been studying." Chen smiled, feeling a satisfaction that was different from the ego-driven pleasure he had once taken in defeating opponents. "I had a good teacher," he replied, thinking of his brief but educational encounter with Master Sergeant Rodriguez. Colonel Patterson, who had been observing the training exercises, approached Chen after the match. "Sergeant, I've been watching your progress since the demonstration with Master Sergeant Rodriguez. I'm impressed with how you've responded to that experience." Chen stood at attention. "Thank you, sir. It was a valuable learning opportunity. I'm recommending you for advanced combat instructor training," Patterson continued. "Your technical skills have always been solid, but now you're showing the kind of tactical, thinking and teaching mindset that makes for effective instructors." The recommendation came as a complete surprise to Chen. He had been so focused on improving his own skills that he hadn't considered the possibility of becoming an instructor himself. The irony wasn't lost on him. His humbling defeat at the hands of Rodriguez had ultimately led to recognition and advancement opportunities he might never have received otherwise. 6 months after his encounter with Master Sergeant Rodriguez, Chen found himself standing in front of a group of new recruits at the base's combat training facility. He had completed the advanced instructor course with top honors and was now responsible for teaching hand-to-hand combat fundamentals to soldiers who were just beginning their military careers. The irony of his situation wasn't lost on him. The same confidence and competitive drive that had led to his embarrassing defeat had now, tempered by experience and humility, made him an effective teacher. He understood both sides of the equation. The eagerness of students who thought they knew more than they did, and the patience required to guide them toward genuine skill and understanding. Among his current group of trainees was Private Jackson, a young soldier who reminded Chen strongly of himself 6 months earlier. Jackson had been a high school football star and carried himself with the kind of casual confidence that Chen now recognized as potentially dangerous. During their first week of training, Jackson had already made several comments suggesting he thought the basic techniques they were learning were beneath his skill level. Chen decided to use Jackson as a teaching opportunity, but he approached the situation very differently than he might have in the past. Instead of directly challenging the young private or trying to humble him through demonstration, Chen began incorporating progressively more difficult scenarios into the training sessions, allowing Jackson to discover his own limitations organically. During one particular session, Chen was demonstrating defensive techniques against multiple attackers. He had arranged for several volunteers to attack him in sequence, showing the students how to position themselves to avoid being overwhelmed. The demonstration went smoothly, with Chen successfully defending against each attack while explaining his strategies to the watching recruits. "It looks easy when you do it, Sergeant," Jackson commented, his tone carrying a hint of skepticism. "But these guys aren't really trying to hurt you." Chen paused his instruction and looked at Jackson thoughtfully. The comment was almost identical to observations he had made about Rodriguez's demonstrations months earlier. He saw an opportunity to provide Jackson with the same kind of learning experience that had transformed his own understanding of combat. You're right, Private Jackson, Chen said calmly. Demonstrations are different from real fights. Would you like to help me show the difference? Jackson's eyes lit up with the same eager confidence that Chen remembered feeling before his own encounter with Rodriguez. Absolutely, Sergeant. Chen could see several of the other recruits exchange glances, and he noticed that some of the more experienced soldiers who were assisting with the training session were watching with interest. Word had spread about Chen's own experience with Rodriguez, and everyone was curious to see how he would handle a situation that paralleled his own past mistake. The scenario is simple, Chen explained to the group. Private Jackson is going to try to take me down using whatever techniques he thinks will work. This will demonstrate the difference between controlled training and actual resistance. Jackson began to prepare himself with the same kind of confident energy that Chen remembered from his own encounter with Rodriguez. The private stretched and shadowboxed, clearly relishing the opportunity to showcase his abilities in front of his peers. Chen watched Jackson's preparation with a mixture of understanding and anticipation, knowing exactly what the young soldier was thinking and feeling. But Chen's approach to the encounter was fundamentally different from Rodriguez's had been with him. Where Rodriguez had been patient and instructional even while demonstrating superior skill, Chen planned to use the situation as a teaching moment from the very beginning. He wanted Jackson to learn something valuable, not just experience defeat. Before we begin, Chen said to the assembled students, I want everyone to pay attention to the principles we'll be demonstrating. Watch how positioning, timing, and technique can overcome raw aggression and physical advantages. Jackson came forward with a combination attack that showed his football background, a strong initial rush followed by an attempt to overwhelm through size and strength. Chen could see the attack developing and had several options for responding. He could have ended the encounter immediately with the kind of swift, decisive technique that Rodriguez had used on him, but instead he chose a different approach. Chen allowed Jackson's initial attack to partially succeed, letting the private get close enough to feel like he was having some effect. But Chen maintained control throughout the encounter, using Jackson's momentum and aggression to set up a teaching demonstration rather than simply achieving a quick victory. When Chen finally executed his counter technique, it was with the same precision and control that Rodriguez had shown, but he took time to explain what he was doing as he did it. Notice how I'm using Jackson's forward momentum against him, he said to the watching students as he redirected the private's attack into a controlled takedown. Jackson found himself on the ground, but the experience had been educational rather than humiliating. Chen had achieved the same result as Rodriguez had with him, but had done so in a way that preserved Jackson's dignity while still making the necessary points about skill and experience. As Chen helped Jackson to his feet, he could see that the young private had learned something important from the encounter. There was still confidence in Jackson's eyes, but it was tempered now with a new respect for the complexity of combat and the value of proper instruction. The key lesson here, Chen said to the entire group as Jackson dusted himself off, is that real combat skills come from understanding principles, not just physical ability. Private Jackson's attack was well executed and showed good fundamentals, but experience teaches you how to read an opponent and respond appropriately. Chen realized that he was unconsciously echoing Rodriguez's words from months earlier, but the lesson felt even more meaningful now that he was the one delivering it. He had gained not just technical skill from his encounter with Rodriguez, but also an understanding of how to pass knowledge on to others in a way that built them up, rather than tearing them down. The rest of the training session proceeded with a new level of focus and respect from all the students. Jackson, in particular, approached the remaining exercises with the kind of humble eagerness to learn that Chen recognized from his own transformation after meeting Rodriguez. 1 year after his famous 2-second encounter with Master Sergeant Rodriguez, Chen was promoted to Staff Sergeant and given responsibility for the base's entire hand-to-hand combat training program. His reputation had evolved from that of the cocky young sergeant who got dropped by a veteran to a respected instructor, known for his technical skill and ability to develop other soldiers. The transformation was complete when Chen received an unexpected visitor at the training facility. Master Sergeant Rodriguez had returned to the base for another demonstration, but this time he specifically requested to observe Chen's teaching methods. The legendary veteran sat quietly in the back of the training area, watching as Chen worked with a group of advanced students. Chen's teaching style had become a blend of technical precision and psychological insight. He understood how to challenge his students without crushing their confidence, and how to build their skills while keeping their egos in check. His own experience of being humbled had given him empathy for soldiers who struggled with the gap between their perceived abilities and their actual skill level. During a break in the training session, Rodriguez approached Chen with the same calm demeanor that had characterized their first meeting. "Impressive work, Staff Sergeant. You've developed into an excellent instructor." Chen felt the same flutter of nervousness he had experienced a year earlier, but now it was tempered with genuine respect rather than misplaced confidence. "Thank you, Master Sergeant. I owe a lot of what I've learned to our encounter last year." Rodriguez smiled. "You owe it to your response to that encounter, not to the encounter itself." Many soldiers would have reacted differently to that experience. The two men walked to a quiet corner of the training facility where they could talk without interrupting the ongoing session. Rodriguez's presence still commanded attention, but Chen no longer felt the need to prove himself against the veteran. Instead, he was genuinely curious about Rodriguez's perspective on teaching and combat. "I've been watching your methods," Rodriguez said. "You found a way to challenge your students while still preserving their dignity. That's not an easy balance to achieve." Chen thought about his approach to teaching and realized that much of it had been shaped by his memory of how Rodriguez had handled their encounter. "You could have humiliated me that day," Chen said. "You had every opportunity to make me look foolish in front of my peers, but you chose to turn it into a learning experience instead." Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "Humiliation destroys more soldiers than it improves. The goal is always to build people up, even when you have to knock them down first." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of raised voices from the training area. Chen looked over to see that two of his students had gotten into a heated argument during a sparring session. One was accusing the other of using excessive force, while the accused soldier was defending his actions as necessary for realistic training. Chen excused himself and moved to intervene, but Rodriguez followed, curious to see how the instructor would handle the situation. The two students were Private Martinez, an experienced soldier who prided himself on his toughness, and Private Thompson, a newer recruit who was still learning to handle the intensity of advanced combat training. "What's the problem here?" Chen asked, his voice calm but carrying clear authority. Martinez spoke first, his frustration evident. "Thompson here thinks we should be going easy on each other. This is combat training, not a dance class." Thompson's face was flushed with anger and embarrassment. "I'm not asking anyone to go easy. I'm just saying there's a difference between realistic training and trying to hurt your training partner." Chen could see that both soldiers had valid points, but more importantly, he could see that the argument was really about different approaches to learning and training. Martinez was the type who believed that harder training automatically led to better results, while Thompson preferred a more measured approach that emphasized technique over intensity. "Both of you make good points," Chen said, stepping between the two soldiers, "but you're arguing about the wrong thing. The question isn't whether training should be easy or hard. It's whether training should be smart or stupid." He gestured for both men to follow him to the center of the training area, where the other students could observe. Chen had learned that individual conflicts often provided opportunities for group learning, and he had become skilled at turning interpersonal problems into teaching moments. "Martinez, you believe that intense training produces better fighters," Chen said. "That's true up to a point. But intensity without control leads to injuries, and injured soldiers can't train at all." He turned to Thompson. "And Thompson, you're right that technique should be emphasized over raw aggression. But technique that can't stand up to real pressure isn't very useful in actual combat." Chen then did something that surprised both students and caught the attention of Rodriguez, who was watching from the sidelines. "I'm going to demonstrate both approaches," Chen announced. "Martinez, I want you to attack me as hard and as realistically as you can. Don't hold back anything." Martinez's eyes lit up with the opportunity to prove his point about intense training. He came forward with everything he had, throwing powerful punches and attempting to overwhelm Chen through sheer aggression. Chen absorbed the attack calmly, using precise defensive techniques to neutralize Martinez's offense without causing injury. When Chen counterattacked, It was with the same measured control that Rodriguez had demonstrated with him a year earlier. He put Martinez on the ground decisively but safely, proving that technique could overcome intensity when properly applied. "Now, Thompson," Chen said as he helped Martinez to his feet, "I want you to attack me using perfect technique but without any real commitment or intensity." Thompson came forward hesitantly, throwing technically correct but half-hearted attacks that Chen easily defended against. When Chen countered this time, he did so with just enough force to demonstrate that Thompson's approach, while safer, wouldn't be effective against a truly determined opponent. "The lesson here," Chen explained to the assembled students, "is that both approaches have their place, but neither one alone is sufficient. You need the technical precision that Thompson represents, combined with the intensity and commitment that Martinez brings to his training." Rodriguez nodded approvingly from his position at the edge of the group. Chen had taken a potentially divisive situation and turned it into a valuable lesson for everyone present. More importantly, he had done so in a way that validated both students' perspectives while showing them how to integrate their different approaches. As the training session concluded and the students dispersed, Rodriguez approached Chen one final time. "You've learned the most important lesson of all," the veteran said. "It's not enough to be skilled yourself. You have to be able to help others find their own path to skill." Chen reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. A year ago, he had been a confident young sergeant who thought he understood combat. His encounter with Rodriguez had shattered that confidence, but in rebuilding it, Chen had discovered something more valuable than mere technical ability: the wisdom to know when to be humble and when to be confident, when to challenge and when to support. The 2-second defeat that had once seemed like the most embarrassing moment of his military career had become the foundation for everything he had achieved since. Chen had learned that true strength came not from never falling down, but from how you chose to get back up and what you did with the lessons learned along the way.